suggested a modification, which I think raises the issue that I think is a broader issue about relying too much on the NHS for robust evidence on the demand for health services. And the point I raised when we discussed it last week, the NHS has a slight conflict of interest, obviously, because it needs to make the books balance. So when it provides information about the requirements for health services in the area, we need to be very careful that it's gone through all the proper processes. And what I said last week was that the processes for redevelopment of Watford Hospital were very thorough, and they went through a lot of public engagement, including on the number of cases that would be projected for each of the 3 hospitals. This has not happened in the case of the Hemel campus project. I think that in itself is a problem, and I would just like to register with you that I think that you need to be a little sceptical about the reassurances from the council that they've been liaising, collaborating with the NHS about this, because the NHS has taken a less stringent view, I think, on getting the evidence. And I think there is because the way it's been done for the last 3 or 4 redevelopment occasions has been very thorough. This is less thorough, and I think the danger is that we will under-provide because the information from the NHS is less good. The particular point on HC6 is that in itself, I think it makes some very useful points, and I think that when it comes to HMO3 and HMO5, it'll be very interesting to see whether it meets those requirements. But the suggestion from the property services, NHS property services, that the council will sort of have to accept their estate strategy, which is an internal document, and their transformation plans, again, internal documents, not necessarily well consulted on. I think that there's a risk there that the council will be under-providing. And I think I would just like to register that I think somewhere here there should be an element of scepticism about it, and that I think the council should, if at all possible, require that when the NHS bring forward suggestions or bring forward projections of the demand, which is a very complicated thing to work out, I think they need to have proper arrangements to get public engagement on that, as they have in past.
Having looked at their suggested main modification, I don't think it is needed for soundness. I think it's simply not needed. It strays into sort of directing the decision maker as to what may or may not satisfy criteria, and that's not what a local plan's about. So I'm pretty happy to sort of say no, that's not something we'd be recommending. What I do want to do is take us back very briefly to the discussion last week, and it's probably a question for the council. Dr. Eilert's right. HC6, it's quite clear, and there's, it replicates other plans all over the country in terms of what you need to do when you're redeveloping community facilities. We talked last week, didn't we, about HM3 and 5, and we talked around, let me just quickly turn them up. Just to reiterate, we talked around modifying these policies to remove this sort of quite ambiguous sort of preference for things going on. And I think when you look back at your HM3 and HM5, have in mind what HC6 says. So I think Dr. Eilert probably is right. HC6 is your go-to policy, and it reflects the NPPF. It reflects the open space things and policies that we talk about. That's all pretty standard. Your site allocations, HM3 and HM5, then need to reflect that sort of, this is what you're doing. And again, it's a sort of land use planning document. It's a site allocation. It's providing clarity to decision makers and local communities about where things are going to go, rather than sort of, well, we might do this, we might do that. It really does need to be clearer. So I'd raise that point because HC6 is a useful sort of base for redrafting those policies.
Thank you. I think that is important, and I mean, clearly it does talk about making alternative provision sufficient to make up, if you take provision away, put it back in. That is a good baseline, but obviously that doesn't. And this is the point about the growth in the population. This doesn't, for instance, deal with future growth and the fact we have an aging population. And also the fact to take into account if you have, to stray slightly into HMO3 and HMO5, if you have, wherever the new facilities are in the centre of town, you're going to put 1,500 more homes in there. And are you taking account of the extra demand that will generate, including from the older population who will be accommodated partly on the existing hospital site? So, you know, it seems to me that you need to think about how you provide for that, given that you've got sort of passing, you'll have more passing trade than you've had before because you have more homes close by.
Okay, that was of HC6. We did skip over HC5 there. Any comments on HC5? Mr. Criddles, anything you want to add? So this was about the sort of go-to policy around sort of, you know, what each development would provide. There was, just by way of update, a council suggested change here. So looking towards either Mr. Layden or Ms. Cobingham, do you want to just talk me through why you think that's necessary? And again, this was about specifically about improving open space or making contributions to off-site open spaces.
Yes, this was to provide clarity. And so on reviewing criterion HC 5.6, we considered that there may be some confusion for plan users about where the open space provision requirements cannot be delivered on site might be interpreted to apply only to the specific form and mix of open space provision rather than the full provisions within the policy. We therefore suggested that that final sentence about where it can be demonstrated that the open space provision requirements cannot be delivered on site, contributions will be sought towards improving or delivering open space off-site within reasonable proximity of the development, and be moved to point 7 and stand alone to make that more clear.
You could probably see where what I'm about to say, but there are some very specific metrics in here. Now, I know there's the Fields in Trust guidance. New resident, but if I'm at, say, policy HC5, criterion 5, new residential developments 700 or more homes will be required to deliver allotments or garden space. Not entirely sure where that comes from. It may be that they're based off standard metrics, or maybe there's a locally specific threshold in terms of that. But the main point that I would say is, having tussled with this previously, you've got this be determined in line by local needs and the Fields in Trust recommended benchmark provision. So there's a local component, there's the Fields in Trust general provision. We've got table 17, which is Fields in Trust, but is that conditioned by what is locally available? Does that inform the thresholds? And the thing I don't like about this, and sorry, it's my professional veneer was sliding there, is that this table doesn't make clear if they are exclusive or can overlap. So can allotments also be natural and semi-natural? Are they also amenity green space? I think that is often a problematic when it comes to implementation, that people don't really know what they're aiming for and which requirements apply, whether it's local, fields and trust, and the overlap between different areas. So I don't know if the council has obviously considered those angles and come up with, well, this is an appropriate solution. But from my experience, this leads to a lot of difficulty in terms of effectiveness.
So in terms of the 700 homes threshold, that was calculated looking at the fields in the allotment, the Association of National Allotment Gardeners, I believe, hectares of provision, and then considering what population would be required to generate a usable space as an allotment. But I appreciate that the way community gardens are coming forward is changing, and that there's much more emphasis now on small spaces within the community where which can provide opportunities, and certainly that fits in with the Hemel Garden Communities Framework, so we can take that away and have a look at it. In terms of the overlap, we have made that clear in point 4, specifically for suitable alternative natural green space and natural and semi-natural green space, because we appreciate that there might be confusion where a SANG is being provided on site as to whether the development also then has to provide semi and natural and semi-natural green space on top. But we're happy to take away your other points you raised and see if we can find wording which is clearer.
I think just in terms, is it a point of soundness? Yeah, maybe it is in terms of effectiveness, just in terms of people working out practically what they need to provide, and also the councils take a clear basis on decision taking. I think the way it's phrased at the moment, you've got criterion 6, you've got local needs. So of course, allotments, you may have a site that is next to allotments. For example, there are allotments on the to the sort of northeast of the Maylands, around around the Maylands Business Park. And so it may be that you're informed by local needs and therefore don't need to fully apply the fields interest recommendation. It may be that there are existing lacks that you need to make up. I fear in terms of the practical effect of that, it's going to be very hard to know how to take a decision or know what to aim for. So I think if there's some clarity about the overlap, about whether you go with the kind of local needs or the fields and trusts would be useful for effectiveness. But I think that's my only point on that one, on HC5. Thank you.
Thank you.
So is that a case that there may be sort of site-specific circumstances which would point you to a sort of, one particular direction as to which, as to what you provide? Okay. Any other comments, Mr. Criddle? Do you have anything else you want to say just in HC5 or 6?
I think I've probably stretched your credibility as far as I can, or my credibility with yourselves as far as I can. Your credibility is fine. I think. No, seriously. I mean, there are still issues that we feel aren't resolved here. I don't think we're going to get any further with them, except that you've got to draw a line somewhere. It would be nice to think that there could be some movement from the planners on some of the issues where they can move towards the points we've raised in the future, and that maybe there's some way that you can at least put some sort of onus on them through your report to ask them to at least look at that. I could come up with another 20 or 30 points to contest what has been said from that side and to reaffirm the argument, but I think it's been made. So I'll cut my losses and leave it at that.
And a lot of these topics, they do cross over hearing sessions. Obviously, like I said, last week we talked a lot about treeing. In particular, we've got sessions on Berkhamsted to come. And also, that's why I was talking about delivery, because we've got a session on housing delivery, when I'll be sort of putting some questions to the council, and right, you say this site's going to come forward in 2027, but we know it's in this settlement where you need to provide A, B, C, X, Y, and Z. Is that actually going to happen? That's my question about, well, if they don't provide these things, what then happens? What happens to these developments? Do they even come forward? So that was around that. Okay. Questions to council. We have reached 5:30, which is the end of today. However, we do, by my count, only have 2 policies outstanding, I think. HC7 and E5. And I've only got a very couple of... Do you want to part those for another day, or do you want to keep going? Yeah? Keep going? Should we have a very quick 5-minute comfort break, and then we'll come back and say, I've only got 1 question on both of those policies. So unless anybody has anything else to say on any of the other sort of HC policies that we've heard today? No? Okay, we'll take a very quick 5-minute comfort break, and we've just got E5 and HC7. So we'll adjourn, and for those who want to talk about those policies, we'll just resume back in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. Two policies left, E5 and HC7. E5, all new development of 30 or more dwellings or non-residential buildings of 1,000 square metres must demonstrate how opportunities for local employment, apprenticeships and training can be created through the development and seek to maximise opportunities for sourcing local products, supplies and services. What's the justification for that?
The council's hearing statement, matter 8, issue 3, question 3, explains about the demographic data for Hempstead in particular, and how it's important for those communities to benefit from the development that's taking place, and in particular to be upskilled to meet the opportunities for employment which are coming forward, particularly within the Maylands area where the Hearts IQ Enterprise Zone focuses on modern technologies. So the purpose of E5 social value is to capture some of those additional benefits through training, employment for Dacorum's communities, so that they can secure additional benefits from growth.
What's the 30 dwellings based on?
That refers back to the work that was done for the social value SPD. That has been through some consultation processes and reflects those criteria. However, it should be noted that the council's approach to employment and skills has changed since the draft SPD was prepared, and the policy wording doesn't reflect all the points within the SPD. For that reason, the council has suggested that it's necessary for the employment and skills supplementary planning document to be removed from the policy wording itself, which is not necessary anyway because it's already within the background text. The council's intention is to update the guidance after plan adoption and refer this as a guidance document rather than SPD.
The first part of E5 is, there are other policies out there like this. Where I struggle slightly is maximise opportunities for sourcing local produce, supplies and services both during construction operation. You effectively have no control over that, do you? Especially in terms of operation. So why set out as a development requirement? And equally, is it, what are you trying to achieve? So you're saying to a developer, you've got to source local products, suppliers and services. Is that a land use planning requirement? How are you going to, as a council, enforce that?
From my experience of this, and there's a few examples where that has been a policy requirement elsewhere, again, from my time in Oxfordshire, we have policies within plans there, community employment plans. The wording of that is very, very similar. I know the practical implementation of that is that the social value, I think within those contexts, they were seeking a specific plan, community employment plan, that would spell out some of these elements. Now, the need for a plan where outline was there would be secured by condition, or it would be something that we picked up as a condition relative to be picked up at a later stage. And
I think where I'm going with the social value is, you're right, there are policies like this. It's where you're straying into the sourcing of local products. Why? What is it about a local product? What is local? And really, when you're delving into the operation, you have absolutely no control in the operational stage of development of what anybody products is using. So that's just, it's just not effective. If there was a reason, if there was a specific reason why you want developers to use local products,
it's, and probably again, if it's helpful, if this does result in something, we could seek to clarify in the plan. But from my understanding, it's overarching as part of the climate emergency that the council has declared. And I think it's about sourcing things locally rather than seeking to get something from halfway across the country.
and that's the key. It may well be, in that case, you're talking about, you're sort of introducing the sustainability argument, but what happens if something is produced locally, which is massively unsustainable compared to something which you can source from slightly further away, that is far more sustainable? It's too ambiguous.
And I'd just say that, I think that point's hit, but there is a policy, and I can't remember, is it CC1 that we're going to talk about tomorrow afternoon that has a similar requirement from a an embodied carbon perspective, which we can talk about tomorrow. But I think I would agree with Mr. Birkinshaw that the sort of the purpose of that becomes clear when you read CC1 rather than it being included in E5.
Thank you. Within the context of produce, and I will absolutely take the points away, and we will look at that. It's in the context perhaps of building materials and elements like that. So if something can be sourced locally in terms of building materials to informed construction rather than to rely on something, and whether there is points that, would that be a more effective point in regards to this? I think it's quite clear with regards to suppliers and services, with regards to those that might be involved in various stages of construction or implementation. But it's probably that point about looking around you to see where you can source materials, you can source minerals, you can source these things locally, and at least giving an understanding to that if you're expected to source material, but someone is saying they could source it, they normally get it from 600 miles away. Is there an advantage? I see your point.
I think about the effectiveness of it. I don't want to get in a situation where you're requiring, there's a lot of good to this policy, but I don't want to get in a situation where you're ultimately requiring a developer to say, I will get my plasterboard from here, and then at a sort of planning permission stage, you are not going to go out on site and ask them where their plasterboard is from, for example. It's just not something you can feasibly, realistically do. I think as Mr. Bristow said, there's probably more within some of your sustainable design and construction policies, sort of a lot. That's where some of these things crop up. I think policy 5 is about social value. It's about the sort of like exactly you said, it's about upskilling the local workforce, targeting recruitment, offering placements, all these things. I think it then probably just slips a little bit in terms of the sort of sourcing local products, and we'll come on to talk about that in future sessions. I don't know why that was on that session, but there you go. E5, it was a hangover from this morning. HC7, which is the final one. Community stewardship and management. So this takes us back to the local open space. A new open space on community facilities will be expected to set out a long-term strategy for their management and maintenance. Okay, this will be secured by condition or legal agreement, and the maintenance of open spaces should be in accordance with the council's guidance. So again, you know what to do there. The final bit says, where the council is involved in the stewardship or maintenance of a development, a community sum will be required, secured by legal agreement. This will require the submission of a site plan, management plan, maintenance schedule. Okay. It does also refer to stewardship costs, does it? Where is it? On-site allocations. I thought this referred to stewardship long-term costs.
It's got stewardship funding arrangements.
Yeah.
And then it's got commuted sum in criterion 3. So you could read it that the requirement is there on someone who is providing that open space to maintain it and to give a commuted sum to the council to also maintain it. And I think that's where there's potentially a little bit of confusion. And obviously, commuted sums, management companies, to manage space that is created by virtue of development are sort of par from the course. What I couldn't quite understand is when would the council be involved in the stewardship? Presumably there would be an analogy to a road that would be created that then the county council might adopt, provided it's created to the right standards. Presumably that would be the same of open space provision, that developers' liability, if I could call it that, would extend to providing a space that would be necessary for the council to take on as whatever facility, rather than then also paying for its ongoing maintenance. I may be reading too much into those two criteria, but I just wasn't clear what the expectation is on, say, a developer relative to, for example, what would be funded by SIL or what the council would do anyway, or take on a liability. I may be overthinking that. That is a habit of mine.
It's more ultimately, you know, obviously, and it's a theme that's cropped up today around effectiveness around open spaces. There's different, there's funding arrangements and there's commuted subs. Just talk me through what exactly HC7 is requiring of a developer.
In terms of HC7.3, that is the scenario where a developer provides open space and the council adopts it. And in those circumstances, we've been specific about the type of information that we would require to enable us to calculate the commuted sum, which would be transferred to the council for us to maintain that facility in the future. The funding of long-term stewardship of local assets in 2 relates back to the developing HGC stewardship policy, SPD, which is currently being consulted upon, and the costs which might be associated with that.
Just using that as an example, where appropriate, details of the stewardship strategy should be provided at the application stage and include stewardship objectives and funding arrangements. Would they be known at the application stage? Also, I'm talking about obviously, you know, big strategic sites here, Hemel Garden communities, for example. Would they be known at that stage?
They would be, I'd expect that they would be known for the large sites such as Hemel Garden communities. I think that the position of the stewardship SPD has developed since we wrote the policy, and now, as I say, it's open to public consultation and is expected to be adopted. So there is likely to be the need for us to review the supporting text and just check that that is embedded within it to make it clear to plan users.
I think so, because there's only a couple of paragraphs. I think this is going against the grain of my suggestions of less is more. But again, there was just some sort of questions that we had around, okay, what scenarios are we in? And I think obviously you understand them and you've written the plan, but we sort of sat down together and said, well, what's this scenario? What's that scenario? So just making it clear for effectiveness through the supporting text as to what those scenarios might be, and then a couple of examples I think would be useful if we were just unsure as to where's this money going, because then you've got the cross-reference, obviously, similar regulations, etc. So just making that abundantly clear, really. Anything else? No. So that was a sort of a quick canter through of the policies. As I said, we've talked in this session. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, just on HC7, there's been a long-standing debate about community asset management within Dacorum, where there's been generally a reluctance from the council to adopt that and especially for sports facilities, which is done in some other councils. With the development of hand garden communities, there's obviously within the vision for that, stewardship is is right at the heart of it, and therefore there's a sort of difference between the community asset management approach in hand garden communities to what has been traditionally within Dacorum. I don't know whether this is the right place for this to be covered and not in policy, but it'd be good if we could clarify somewhere within this what the policy is. For example, you talked about scenarios, but if a developer has come up with sports provision on site, who will then own and who will then manage that facility? And I thought that I would find that here, and perhaps it's somewhere else, but it doesn't seem to be clarified. So it would be useful for us to know what the policies are likely to be on that and what the approach is. Obviously, I appreciate it might vary from site to site and from developer to developer and from provision to provision, but nevertheless, if we're going to have a policy, then that should say what is trying to be achieved, I would have thought.
Thank you. I think it's a valid point. We'll take that away and consider it. I think that it's the final point you said there, which I completely understand. It is that what is it, and case by case basis, how would we treat that? I don't know if it's perhaps a point of policy in itself. It is more about the guidance and detail of maybe how the council will go about that in terms of whether there be a first preference in terms of who we might speak to.
Is that sort of hierarchy and those sort of general expectations that set out in your guidance that you're consulting on at the moment? Sorry, this is mostly looking to Mr. Lydon. So you're consulting on the stewardship guidance. Does that provide any clarity to people like Mr. Criddle who will sort of look, okay, so what's the council's approach to whether they're taking on a site or if it's going to be owned by a management company? Is that in that document at all?
The detail of that is something I might not be able to respond clearly to that now. I know it in the background, we're looking at the various models for stewardship and looking at practical kind of delivery for and how things will be implemented. And there's a few options being considered there, but as mentioned today, stewardship can be wide-ranging and cover a wide range of different types. I would expect it is, but I might just have to take that away and double check that.
No, I understand that. It would just be interesting because I can see where you're coming from, Mr. Criddle, in terms of policy HC7. There's a criterion 2. Okay, you're going to explore what is the right approach with the council if you're bringing something forward. Where appropriate, you're going to provide details and funding, and that's all in accordance with the council's stewardship guidance. So I presume, in a lot of other areas, there's a preference, say, for a certain model that is known to work. Say, for example, I use the example of adopted roads. A road is created to a standard that can then be adopted by the highways. That's their preferred approach, it seems to be. If there is something there in the guidance or that needs to be reflected in the policy in terms of, well, what is the preference? I think that could be useful. So yes, if you're happy to take away looking at the guidance any responses to that, whether there's a particular preference in terms of, well, what is the best outcome for communities? Is it best, is it the council's view it's best in this way or that way? I think articulating that through the policy could be useful. But
okay, thank you. I think come what may, the advice is helpful given that we're at the consultation on that SPD anyway. So we can obviously take that into account before it's finalised and probably ensure that it is as clear as it can be.
Because the policy is about community stewardship, but as I said, it is actually just about generic management as well, presumably. So I think probably just making it clear and giving, clarity to users of the plan as to what the sort of council's preference is. But I accept that. I think you're probably right. It would vary on a case by case basis.
Yeah, and as I said that in there, I understand that there will be variances, but it'd be interesting to get a feel for what the council's approach, or as you say, preference is, whether that can be provided later. But I mean, for example, there are a number of sites which have already come up, which are part of this local plan. Has there been consultation between developers and any sports organisations or clubs or governing bodies about management of any of those facilities? Is that something that is taking place within the process? And can you quote any examples for us?
It's up to you how you want to respond.
Yeah, just going to the time today and the detail, I think the request is, I probably appreciate we could probably just have that conversation offline if possible. But I think just on the points, what is working in the background as part of the draft SPD, there's cost-effective model is being tested right now. And with that, there is a long list of assets that are being formed part of that. And I would imagine within that would include sports provision as well. So it's all encompassing on that. It's just the specific points of, when we think about a hierarchy of probably sports and leisure provision relative to various other forms of stewardship and assets that can be secured, through this policy. I just don't have the detail right in front of me right now to be able to respond.
Okay, thanks. So you're going to take that away, have a look what's coming through consultation, have a look what the stewardship guidance does, and potentially articulate a preference through that policy, which I think would be clear. Ms. Foster.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment about stewardship. And I don't know if this is how you build this in or if it's appropriate to build. There was a site in Berkhamsted some years ago where football pitches were provided. It took 7 years from the site coming online to those being released to be used.
That's a question about, sorry, is that a question about stewardship or is that a question about the timing of delivery? So, sorry, you said there was a development and then it took 7 years for something to come forward to be delivered in the first.
To be delivered. It was part of the arrangement, and the developer was funding football pitches, but it took 7 years for those to be released for use.
Well, obviously, I don't know the specifics of that, but and sorry if this is a bittersweet question to potentially end on, but we've got Strategic Policy ID1 that is quite clear, that says the timing of the provision of infrastructure should be linked directly to the phasing of development to ensure that infrastructure is provided in a timely and comprehensive manner to support new development. Now, I know in that instance, obviously, that didn't happen, but does that sort of clear articulation of that give you any comfort that this plan will try and achieve that? Or?
No.
Sorry, perhaps I should not. Mr. Layden, anything you want to comment on that?
I think needless to say, I don't have much more to add. We're trying to get an up-to-date plan. We're trying to get local control. How things are secured. Obviously, there's legal agreements in place for how infrastructure is secured, and they're binding. And surely if there's any issues with that, the council's got opportunities to enforce as appropriate. But I'm quietly comfortable that what we're trying to do here, everything we're trying to do here, is trying to get a plan in place to regain control, to look at growth holistically alongside infrastructure. Notwithstanding the fact there's applications happening at the moment, the council is trying to do its best to get ourselves back on the train tracks again moving forward with regards to the cumulative impacts of and the infrastructure asks. And this isn't the end of the conversations and the dialogue on sports and others. We have meetings lined up We want to keep those conversations going. We want to find solutions. Thank you.
Yeah, let's not delve into too much specific. Again, mindful we've got sort of a session on Berkhamsted. So.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, the reason I raised that was stewardship. The 7 years was the arguing between the council and the developer as to who was going to take it on.
Okay, anything that anyone's not raised they want to? No? Anything from you, Mr. Stone?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you all for your time. I appreciate we have gone over, but we both really appreciate everyone sort of staying and making sure that we can get through it. So there's a lot of policies in this local plan, and it's important that everyone has their say and has an opportunity to put forward their representations accordingly. So thank you all for your input, and thank you for those points which we will certainly take away and discuss. Any matters arising for the council, any housekeeping matters, anything to be aware of for tomorrow?
Nothing for tomorrow,
No.
sir. No.
No? Okay. Thank you all for your time then. We'll adjourn for today and then we'll resume back tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you.